The last few units, we've been doing custom cells using Storyboard. So we go to Storyboard. We have a table view, and we add a prototype cell on that scene, and we customize that cell, right? That's how we've been doing custom cells, right? Custom cells, as we will see in Unit 4, you could do custom cells all programmatically, which we'll be doing in Unit 4. You could do custom cells using Storyboard, which we've done in Unit 3 and Unit 2. You could also do, as we'll see today, you could also do custom cells using what's known as xib files, XIB, right? XIB, zip files, or it's also known as nib files. So XIB stands for Xcode Interface Builder. It's an older way to code out UI. It's still being used today. I've worked on it in the past on projects at my old job, so it's still around. As I said before, anything that's to deal with iOS or programming in general, it never really completely goes away. So as a developer, you have to know all the parts of your craft, right? So today we'll see what a xib looks like and how we could use a xib to create a custom cell. And as I said, XIB stands for Xcode Interface Builder, or it's also known as a nib file, which stands for Next Interface Builder. Next was Steve Jobs' old company before he went back to Apple. So when he got ousted out of Apple, he went to create Next. After that, Apple acquired Next, and right? So whenever we see NS, that's next step, right? When we see NS string, that stands for next step string, right? That prefix there, right? Great. So we have a project here. We have a starter project. It's a podcast project. We've worked on that project for like review in Unit 3, but today we'll use a zip file to render our custom cells. And this is a perfect example of using a zip file, right? Because as we did this project, we had multiple cells. We had a cell, the same cell, on the podcast search controller. We had a cell there. We also had the same exact cell on the favorites controller. Do we remember that? Right? So if you have a zip file, you could use that same zip file across different storyboards or different view controllers, right? So it becomes very reusable. You could even share it with a team member or a different project. You could take that same zip file and use it on a different project. The zip file itself is its own container, like its own model. Okay? So let's see what that looks like to create it. We all have access to that project, so go ahead and click on, not models, click on the podcast cell in the views folder, access the views folder, and click on the podcast cell.swift. We'll create a podcast cell.zip file to work with that cell. Because now, as we saw in our storyboard does not have a cell, right? Our storyboard for our podcast search controller does not have a cell. It only has a table view. Same as our favorites controller. It only has a table view. There's no cell right now. So if you try to run the app, it will crash. It's trying to find a cell, there's no cell. A table view needs a cell. Great. So let's go ahead, click on our podcast cell.swift. Right-click on it. Right-click on it. And click on New File. Click on New File. And where it says User Interface, do we all see User Interface in the dialog, right? So we may or we may have not created a storyboard, but you can create your own storyboard. So far, we've only created one storyboard, or we have one storyboard that comes with our Xcode project. We're not talking about SwiftUI right now. You could create a zip file with a view already existing, but the zip file we'll be creating is empty. So make sure you select empty. You could also create your own non-screen here. So select empty, make sure you select empty, and click next. And convention is to name the zip file. For example, we'll create a cell. Convention is to name that zip file the same as the podcast cell.swift, the same name. So we'll be calling it podcast cell, right? So don't name it something else. It will be harder to figure out which one is associated with what. So the zip file is the UI. The podcast cell.swift is the code. Okay, that's where our code is. Like for example, configure cell and all that stuff there. The name of the zip file that we're creating now will be the same name as the podcast cell.swift. We have a podcast cell.swift already, correct? Different extensions. One would be called .swift, one is .zip. It could be the same name, different extension. Everybody got a minute question? Just clarifying like how does Xcode differentiate? Different extensions, you could have the same file name, okay? All right, so go ahead and create or type in podcast cell here. Again, it's not going to give you an error or anything like that if it's a different name, but convention is to name it the same as that zip file, as the class. Okay, so we have podcast cell here. We say create. And now we have an empty canvas. Our canvas is completely empty because we started off with an empty view, correct? It was an empty view. We have nothing in that empty view. So now we'll go to our object library and we'll select a table view cell, and drag the table view cell into the canvas. So go ahead, go to our library, our object library, and search for cell. It's not a collection view cell. We'll talk about collection views next week. It's a table view cell. Drag it over. Great. So at this point, we have a cell, and we are free to do whatever we want with that cell. With whatever UI we want to do on that cell, we are able to do it. You have a question? Okay. The height of the cell will make it 180. So go over to your size inspector. Go over to your size inspector and change the height to 180. It may not exactly render. If it doesn't render, you could just drag it to 180 points. Make sure the height is 180 points here. So you could actually just drag it and do so. Okay. Again, whatever we do here in Canvas doesn't affect the height. But in our code, we are returning 180. So if we go back to our controller, it returns 180 in the height for row. In the height for row at, it returns 180. But right now, as we're laying out our views, we want to make sure the views are being rendered the way we want it to look. So that's why we're making the height the same here. Okay, so next up, we need an image view. So let's go ahead and get an image view. We get an image view, we'll pin the image view to the top of the cell, we'll pin the bottom of it to the bottom of the cell, and the width will be 180, it will be a square. So let's go ahead and set up the constraints for that image view. So we go to our add constraints, and we said we're pinning it to the top, so it's 0 to the top, 0 to the lead-in, and 0 to the bottom. And the width will be 180. So change that value. Whatever your value is, make sure it's 180 for the width. For the width, make sure it's 180 and add 4 constraints. So when you're done, add 4 constraints. Oscar, question? Good? Okay, cool. So we have that. We have our image view. Let's go ahead and add a placeholder image for our image view. Select your image view, go over to the attributes inspector, and for the image, we will look for, it's a podcast, so just look for Mike here. Mike, we'll take Mike Phil. So it's Mike.Phil, it's an SF symbol. Yes, sir?
Have you been getting this like new thing that when you try to constrain things, it sets it to state what? Yeah, it's a standard thing.
Please go back to standard.
Is there a way to, there's this thing that's been happening in Xcode, I think it's from an update, that if you try to put it at 0, it puts it as standard, which is not actually 0, and then you have to set it separately to zero?
Let's take a look at that offline. Definitely pull me the minute the lecture is over, so us to take a look at it. And let's see what different Xcodes we have. Cool?
Okay.
All right, great. So we have a placeholder image. It's an SF symbol. Again, SF symbols is new only in iOS 13. If you're trying to use it earlier, it won't work. So we have our image. Let's make sure our image, the content mode on it is aspect fill. So change it to aspect fill. Cool. Next up, we'll add 2 labels. So let's go ahead and add 2 labels here. Label. The first label, I will call it collection name. I will option drag. I haven't set up the constraints yet for it. I will option drag to get a second label. And this label, I'll call it artist name. Is it artist name? 1 second, let me double check my cell here. Collection name, artist name, okay. So we have collection name and we have artist name. Before we set constraints, we could change the fonts. We could make the collection name be bold. So let's go to the font section here and make it semi-bold. So I'm changing the style to semi-bold for the collection name. And for the artist name, I'm changing it to light. Great, cool. So now we could add our constraints. So the constraints for the collection name, we'll go ahead, we'll click on add constraints. Let me zoom in here. I'll make it 8 everywhere except the bottom. We don't need to do the bottom here. So 8 to the top, 8 to the lead-in or the trailing of the image view, and 8 to the trailing of the cell. So those are 3 constraints. Great. Next up, we'll add constraints for the artist name. So for the artist name, I will click on artist name, click on add constraints. It's going to be 8 to the bottom of the collection name, 8 to the trailing of the image view, and 8 to the trailing of my cell. So our podcast cell only has 3 elements for now. Other things we need to change, collection name, we'll keep collection name number of lines at 1, but artist name, we'll change it to 3. So number of lines for artist name, we change it to 3. And collection name stays at the default one line, okay? Because the artist name sometimes is longer, so that way it could grow at least 3 lines. Okay? Any questions so far with what we've done? So far what we've done, we've added a view, which is known as a nib or a xib file. We've added 3 elements to that cell. We dragged in a cell to the empty view. We dragged in a cell to the empty view, and we added 3 elements to that cell. That's what we've done so far. Yes, it's a view. It's a bit similar to Storyboard, but it's self-contained. Yeah. So Amini was asking, what's the difference between a storyboard and a zip file? The zip file, as we saw now, it's self-contained, so I could use it in different views or view controllers, right? Because at the end of the day, at the end of this lesson, we'll be able to use that same cell in the podcast search controller and also in the favorites controller, right? Same cell. Again, you could take that same cell, bring it to a different project, right? As opposed to a whole storyboard, there's things in the storyboard you do not need. But in that case, you only have a cell here, right? So you could come here and create like a small element that you want and port it wherever you want. Okay, cool. Good, good, good. Next things we need to do, click on your cell.
When you say import it however you want, how do you import
Like you could actually take the file out there and drag it to a different project and have the same cell work with the same cell.
And you would drag it into
Like add files to a different project. Yeah, exactly. Click on your cell. We need to give it a class to manage it. So click on your cell, open the documents outline, click on your cell, and go to the custom class here. Do we all see custom class? Do we all see custom class for the cell? Cell? So that custom class, it's going to be the podcast cell. Make sure you press enter, as we always do with Storyboard. Again, there's similarities there between Storyboard and zip files. So make sure the class is podcast cell. Make sure you press enter so that that check mark gets activated. And also, we need to give it a reuse identifier. So the reuse identifier will be lowercase podcast cell. Again, please be very, name it the same because we have the code already for it. So make sure it's podcast cell the same as we have here. And press enter. Where do we what? I'm sorry. That's the task, the starter project we just, I slacked out. Yeah. Yeah. The only thing, I only want to focus on the custom cell. I don't want to focus on anything else. There's other things we'll see, but I just want to keep it focused on custom cell. That's why I did a starter project. Any questions? Make sure you have your custom class set up and make sure you have your reuse identifier set up as well. Okay? All right. So now let's open up the assistant editor. Yes, sir. Lowercase podcast cell. Camel case, right? So lowercase p, uppercase C, and it's singular, not plural. Let me go back to it. So for my cell here, here, everybody could see the reuse identifier, podcast cell. Okay. Open up your assistant editor. Open up your assistant editor. Open up your assistant editor. If the cell class does not automatically open, option click on it. Make sure you have them side by side, like we always do with Storyboard. Yes? Okay. And at this point, what are we doing? We're just dragging over. So drag the image view from the cell class over to our image view on our zip, on our cell zip. Drag the collection name over to the collection name label and drag the artist name label over to the artist name. So we've connected our labels, our outlets, to our zip table view cell. Any questions before we move back over to the controllers? Any questions about zips? Yes?
At this point, if we wanted to reuse the cell, the class itself we would still have to create, or
the two of them basically work hand in hand, right? Because you have the view, but you need some sort of code to manage it, correct?
Yeah.
So you could take the two of them together and put them in a different project.
Okay.
Make sense? And there's no coupling with anything else. Like the podcast cell needs a podcast, that's it. Yeah. Very good. Okay, so let's go to our podcast search controller. So Cameron, get the project started, and if you have any questions, right? Okay, so we're going back to the controller, and we have to-dos. Part of any project, if you have to-dos, it's easy to find your to-dos. So let's go ahead and see what to-dos we have. If we navigate over, do we all see the search, the magnifying glass there, that search bar there? Do we all see the search icon? Click on the search icon. And if you want to search for any text within your project, this is the place to go. I've marked a bunch of to-dos. So if we search for to-do and press enter, we'll see the to-dos we have. And you could jump to a to-do very quickly, right? There's ways to mark your code as being incomplete. One of the ways is a to-do. There's also a fix me that you could use, like fix me like this, right? You could use those as marks. That way you could jump to it as you need. Okay? Everybody? Yes? Okay, cool. So we have to-dos that we need to do. Great. The first to-do that we need to take care of is register the podcast nib. Right now, our table view does not have a cell. It doesn't know what cell, how to get a cell. The way we do in Storyboard to give the table view a cell is to register a cell in the Storyboard. Right now, the Storyboard doesn't have a cell at all. There's nothing to register. A next way you could get a cell is to register a nib. We've created a nib. Now we just need to register the nib with that table view. Everybody with me? As we're getting closer to doing programmable UI, we have to be comfortable with registering things in code, right? Register a cell in code. Register a nib in code, okay? So far we've been doing it in Storyboard. Yes? Luba, question? Okay. All right, so let's see what that looks like. So we have our table view. Everybody has access to, everybody's in the podcast search controller, correct? Yes? Okay, so here we do table view, dot register. Again, those are all the things you could register on a cell, on a table view. You could register a cell class. You could register a nib. Here we're registering the nib. The nib is what we just created, right? Also known as xib. So xib and nib interchangeable for now, okay? Actually, not the footer one. We use the one with the identifiers, all right? So we're accessing register with nib with identifier. That's the one we're after. And press enter. So go ahead and type in UI nib, open parens. Type in UI nib, open parens, and we're accessing the one that says nib name. We'll give it a nib name, the same name as the file we created. So go ahead and press enter on nib name here. It accepts a string. So make sure it's the same name as the file name we created. So this represents podcastcell.xib. Everybody with me? Okay? And the bundle, we pass in nil here. And for the reuse identifier, we pass in lowercase podcast, camel case, cell. So this is very important. You must have that or else your app will continue crashing because the table view does not have a cell. The table view does not know where to get that cell. Okay? So the same way we do in Storyboard, we say cell is podcast cell, and we give it a reuse identifier in Storyboard. Here in code, this is what's happening in code. In code, we tell the table view, here's the cell for you, it's a nib. We give it the nib name, and at that point, the table view is happy. Okay? So we're done with that to do. I'll keep the comment here, but I'll just take out the to do word. Is there any more to do in this particular line of code here? Or implement did select. Okay, we should be able to run our code now without that order to do and see if we get our cell. Let's go ahead and do that now. If we have any issues, we'll fix it. So go ahead and Command R, run your app, and search for some podcast. Right? So mine works. I search for NPR, I got NPR stuff. Or some maybe NPR stuff or not, right? Whoa, two, this is not safe space here. What's happening? Luba, what are you doing? Okay, family-friendly show. I search for Swift, I get Swift. This is the cell we created, everybody. This is the cell we created. We now just created a custom cell using a nib or a xib, okay? Any questions before we move on? What's the fatal error say? Because there's fatal errors there. If you're trying to favorite something, you got to change your name. So I put fatal errors there on purpose.
But I couldn't search for.
You cannot search yet. What? Sorry, you could search. You should be able to search. Search works.
Well,
What's the fatal error say?
Could not downcast. Could not downcast the podcast.
Make sure your names are the same.
For the
make sure the names are the same. Make sure the name is the same that you created. If you created it like you called it podcast cells, it should be the same podcast cells. Just nib file, look at your nib file, how you named it. How is everybody doing? Luba, were you able to see your cell? Good. Greg, were you able to see your cell? Greg?
Working on it.
What's the error?
I had to register my team.
Oh, your team.
It was your zip file, so your info is in the signing capability screen.
Okay.
So I had to switch that over.
Okay. Anybody else have any issues? Everybody's good? Okay, cool. So we saw that. I left it to do, that order to do in the favorites view. In the favorites view, that will be up to you to do. We won't do that one together. That will give you practice. Everybody? Everybody. Whatever we did here in this controller, you have to do the same thing in the favorites controller. So it gives you a chance to practice. Okay?
So in the favorites controller, we're also just registered.
That's it. That's it. Yes.
When else would, wait, well not when else, but what other types of views would this be useful to have?
Some people create like for example, if you have a ratings view, like a ratings, like some stars, you could create that as a zip file and reuse that different places. So you could create mini views here. As we get more into programmable UI or whatever, you're able to do that. But you could do it interchangeably. You could drag a view into the canvas. In the canvas, what did we drag?
You mean like a view controller?
Like a view controller, but even smaller, like a view itself.
Okay, so, and then we would be able to just reuse.
Exactly, exactly. Exactly, exactly.
You control the table view and all that.
You just like register the zip and then use it where you want to. But for purposes of here, our only preview is the cell for now.
Yeah, I'm just trying to see where
Cells, views, headers, footers, any sort of view you want, you could make a zip from it. You could use a zip from it. You could use a zip to create it. Amini's question was, where else can we use zips? We could use zips anywhere we have a view. A table view cell is a view. Go ahead.
For any graphical user interface.
Exactly. If it's a UI element, you could create it as a zip file. Okay?
Does the custom cell class have to go along with that zip?
In that case, it needs to be managed, right? Like you have an image view. How do you change that image view?
So if I were to bring this zip into a new project, I would have to
The two of them.
the two of them or write my class again.
Exactly.
To decide what-
Exactly. Exactly. Exactly.
So they should work together, but they don't necessarily need to.
Exactly. You'd have a next class managing that view. Yeah. Cool. Yes, sir. Can you what? It depends on what you're doing. I want us to be exposed to everything iOS as far as like fundamentals goes, because you could be working on a project that's older where there's zip files in there. You're not gonna break it or delete it and start from scratch. You'll maintain it, you'll fix it, you'll update it based on what the specs are, right? If you're working on your own project, you could use zips as well, right? Collection views, cells, table view cells, right? You could have different cells and load different zips based on what it is, okay? So far we've seen Storyboard, as I introduced, storyboards to create cells. Now we've seen zips to create cells. In the next 2 weeks, we'll see creating cells all code, right? And then when you get to Swift UI, you'll see VStacks and HStacks and other things there, right? But the more you know in iOS, the better. It makes you more marketable. Because you can be like, oh, I've never seen zips, or I don't like zips, ugh, right? Cool? All right, excellent. All right, so let us continue on here. The last to do we'll do, before our time is up here, is something else that we haven't, or some of us haven't seen. How to pass data without a prepare for segue, right? So far we've seen prepare for segue, right? Prepare for segue gets called when a view transitions from A to B, but there's other ways to pass data, right? I could pass data through code using the navigation controller if I have access to it. The view controller itself could present an X view without prepare for segue. So today we'll take a look at implementing did select row at which is a delegate method on a table view. A table view has this method called didSelectRowAt. So whenever you click on a cell, that particular method gets called. Okay? I click on a cell, didSelectRowAt gets called. I could do code in there if I want. Okay? The code we'll do in there when we select the cell is get the instance of the controller that we want to go to, very similar to like in Prepare for Segue. You want to get the instance of the thing you're going to give it data. Yes? Prepare for Segue, right? If I'm going to a detail view, I want to get that detail view to pass it a book or pass it a person. Yes? Okay. So we'll get an instance using the storyboard. We haven't used the storyboard explicitly. The storyboard has its own API. I could talk to the storyboard via this variable. So I'll use the storyboard, get an instance of the detail controller. Once I get an instance of the detail controller, I'll set a podcast on it, and then I'll use the navigation controller. The navigation controller, everybody, it's embedded in a navigation controller. And I'll say navigation controller, push view controller. Right? So that navigation controller now is that container. It will push this controller on top of the stack. So if the controller has only one view controller on it, and I say push view controller, it will have two view controllers. Everybody with me? A stack of plates. Push new pancake. Push new view controller. Okay? So that's a stack data structure. The navigation controller uses a stack data structure. Okay? Push, pop. Right? Push is to add, pop is to remove. Everybody with me? Stacks are coming up next week, right? Stacks are awesome. Okay, cool. So let's go ahead and do that. Where are we? We're inside of the extension for the UI table view delegate. That's where we are. UI view delegate has hide for row, which we did. Oh, by the way, let me mention this here for the curious minds. Scroll view did scroll. What does this do? If I have my keyboard visible, right, and I'm searching for something, I want to get rid of that keyboard, correct? Yes? No? Maybe? I'm searching for, let me bring it up here. Okay, so keyboard come up. Great, keyboard come up. I'm searching for something. The keyboard is still visible, correct? I want to make that keyboard disappear or dismiss as I scroll. Everybody with me? Currently, your application, not this one, your own application, probably when you scroll, the keyboard still stays up, correct? Yes? And you're like, oh my God, can I get it out? Then you probably have to click search bar or something like that to make it dismiss. Yes? This little function here, scroll view did scroll, it's part of iOS, it's part of the scroll view delegate. As I scroll, this gets called. Scroll view did scroll gets called. That's not a function I wrote. That's a delegate method. Everybody with me? Whenever you scroll something, that method gets called. Whether it be a text view is still scrollable. Whether it be a collection view, whether it be anything that scrolls, again, inherits from what class? Scroll view, right? If it scrolls, it inherits from scroll view. If it inherits from scroll view, your delegate could have this method. Okay? So as we scroll, what happens? What does this code do? It's going to dismiss the keyboard, correct? So as I scroll here, keyboard is gone. Okay, everybody? Cool, great. If there's any part of the app, again, that you see, like, oh, what's happening here? You could always come to us offline. But I felt like I needed to talk about this one. I'm sorry? That should be in your code, unless you did not unzip the file. Make sure you're in the podcast search controller. Podcast search controller extension UI table view delegate. Okay, let's continue. So what method are we implementing now? What's the to-do say? We here, right? Are we here? Okay, so we're implementing didSelectRowAt. So start typing didSelect and press enter. Again, didSelectRowAt is a method on our UI table view delegate. Our UI table view delegate has a lot of methods. Okay? So this method gets called when I select a row. Let's see what that looks like. So if I print row selected, and then I'll just put in the index, path that row. So we have a simple print statement here. So as we select a row, it will show us what row got selected. Does everybody have that statement? So it's a simple print statement to print out the row index. Okay, let's go ahead and run it. Let's search. I select a row, I see row 0. That makes sense, right? Index 0, yes? Cool? Yes? So every time I click on that row, did select row at gets called. Everybody with me? Okay. Match yet? Still loaded. Okay. Cool. So let's continue on. So we know that function gets called. We know that works. Let's actually write out our logic. So here our to-do says we need an identifier to the podcast detail controller. So in order to get an instance, let me continue reading here. So we need to get an identifier to the podcast detail controller scene in Storyboard in order to get an instance of it. That's very important. If you're trying to get a scene from the storyboard, right? I cannot say, most of us will do that at some point. I cannot say podcast, so loud. I cannot say podcast detail controller like that, right? What's gonna happen? If I do that, I get a new instance of podcast detail controller that's empty. It doesn't have any elements that I created. Everybody with me? We'll come into that, we'll be like, why I don't see my elements, right? Because you created a new instance of nothing. I want to get an instance of something I created already. It exists. So to do that, I need to use the storyboard and say, storyboard, get me this particular view controller in my storyboard file. Okay? We'll come and do more of those as we do programmable UI and mix in code with storyboard. So let's see what that looks like. Number one, what's the to-do say? We have to register the identifier, correct? So go ahead and copy this podcast detail controller, which is the same name as our view controller. The identifier, you could give it any name, but I try to keep it at the same name as the view controller. So let's go over to our storyboard. Go over to the storyboard. You'll get an opportunity again to do this yourself in the second controller. But for now, let's go to, actually you won't. That's the first one, the only one we have here. So go to our podcast detail controller. Everybody access the podcast detail controller. And open up your attributes inspector. Open up your class identifier here. And let me zoom in here. So make sure you have the podcast detail controller selected, yes? Detail controller. Let's zoom in here. Do we all see where it says storyboard ID? Okay, where it says storyboard ID, this is where we paste what we just copied. And make sure you press enter. So where it says storyboard ID here, I could get an instance of that storyboard scene using that ID. Everybody with me? Okay? Again, that ID could be anything you want, but I try to keep it consistent with the name of the controller. Great, so we have that ID here. Make sure you press enter. Any questions before we go back to code? Okay, let's go back to code. Okay, so we'll use a guard statement because we're about to downcast something. So I'll say guard let. For now, I'll just say detail controller. Keep that short. Detail controller equal to, I said we have, every view controller has an instance of a variable known as storyboard. So we'll go ahead and we'll use storyboard here. Right? Storyboard in that instance will refer to the main storyboard. that storyboard refers to the main storyboard. We only have one storyboard. I'm sorry? Every view controller has a view property, right? Every view controller has a navigation controller property. Every view controller has a storyboard property, right? The view controller, UI view controller, right? It has a view. I could just type in view here, correct? Right? It also has a navigation controller. Those are the properties of a UI view controller. And there's many more than that. There's dismiss, right? Well, that's a function. But there's a lot of properties on that view controller. One of them is storyboard. This is what we need. And we need to use that storyboard to say, storyboard, get me this view controller with that ID. Okay? So storyboard dot instantiate view controller with identifier. Okay? Make sure you take the one that accepts the identifier string here. So storyboard instantiate view controller with identifier. The identifier we pass it in is the podcast detail controller identifier. Are we done? What do we have now? What instance do we have? Like if I have to click on detail controller, what is it? What would it be? Kelby?
Podcast detail.
As is right now?
Well, like then you have to like put in add.
Right, so we have to downcast it, correct? Very similar to prepare for segue. Very similar. So here we need to cast it to what type we expect. We expect a podcast detail controller. Right? This code is very similar to prepare for segue, minus in prepare for segue we have segue dot what? Destination, right? But here we have storyboard dot instantiate view controller with identifier. Okay? And here we'll have our usual fatal error if we're not able to downcast it. So failed to downcast to podcast detail controller. Great. What else? What piece of information do we need? What else do we need in order to segue to that order detail controller? What other piece of information we need? We need a podcast, right? How can we get a podcast? Just call it podcast. It's not coming. So what was that? Index path, right? Okay. Should I make a variable? Well, it doesn't really matter. So I'll make a constant here. I'll call it podcast, index path, row. At this point, we have a podcast. Great. In prepare for segue, we're pretty much done at this point, correct? Yes? If this was prepare for segue, there's no more code to write, correct? I'm sorry? We have to assign it. Let's go ahead and assign it. But again, here, are we done? We're done as far as like prepare for segue. If it was prepare for segue, would this code be done? Yes. Okay? But here in did select row add, the code is not done. The only thing it's done here is assign the podcast to the detail controller. But that's not enough to transition from view controller A to view controller B. We have to explicitly say, go ahead and push this view controller onto the stack. Okay? So this is one of the big differences between the prepare for segue and the did select. In did select, you have to explicitly say what you want to do with that detail controller, how you want to present it, right? You could present it modally, you could push it. Whenever we push something, it has to be in the navigation controller stack. We could present a view modally here. I could say view controller, I could say present view controller.
We use this method if you want to do that increment
Yes,
instead of
exactly, exactly. So here I could simply say present, but we don't want to present because present is modally, right? Everybody with me? But it does exist. Like here, if I want to present it modally, this is the code I would write. If I want to present it modally, make it slide from bottom up. But here we want to push it, okay? We want to push it to the detail view. So what are we using? We are using the navigation controller. Let me go back here to show us that it's optional. So navigation controller is optional, right? It's optional. Anybody want to tell me why it's optional? Does every view controller have to be embedded in a navigation controller? No. So it has to be optional, right? Because if I assume this is not optional and I say navigation controller dot push, the app will crash, right? Because there's no navigation controller. So that's a good API design there. It could exist, but ours happen to exist, so it's not going to be nil. But you could find yourself in some view controller, you're like, I want to push. I come to your code, I'm like, okay, but you're not in the navigation controller, so your navigation controller object is nil. Okay? Yes? Okay, cool. So navigation controller dot push, we spoke about push in here. So navigation controller, you're talking to it now in code. You say navigation controller, go ahead and push this view controller onto the stack. This is what you're saying. Navigation controller, we did not create the navigation controller variable. It exists on a view controller. We say navigation controller dot push view controller, and the view controller we pass in here is our detail controller. And we accept the default animation. Whatever smooth animation Apple gives us, that's what we take. At this point, we are done. We are done with the logic to say, give it a podcast and push it onto the navigation stack. Yes, sir?
What happens if you put pause? Is it just...
The transition might be slightly different, but it's not as obscure as you expect it to be. It might be slightly abrupt, but not as abrupt as you expected. Okay, so to review, we need to get an instance. Let me write stuff here so we know what we did. Here, we need to get an instance of the podcast detail controller. I could say this as step one. Next up, the usual get the object. So we need to get the selected object. Is there a question? Object, in that case, is a podcast. Cool. Step 3, I will say set the object on the detail view controller. And step 4, we don't do in prepare for segue because this happens automatically, but here we need to explicitly set the navigation transition. Example, push or present. The view controller. So those are the steps. If you're implementing did select row at, those are the steps you're doing. And as we will see in code, we are not doing this in code. Like if your view controller does not exist in Storyboard, we'll see what's known as dependency injection in like 2 weeks to set up your detail controller using dependency injection. Okay? Cool. Any questions about that so far? What's that? No, I'm not gonna even go in there yet. We'll get there. We'll get there. Okay, so let's run the app and we'll conclude the lecture if all goes well here. So let's search. I know on the keyboard now, title of the keyboard. That transitions. So we should be able to transition, correct? Are we able to go to a detail view? We're able to go to a detailed view, correct? Great. So any questions? We've done a bit of stuff today. The big part of today was creating the zip file. We created the zip file. It was called podcastcell.zip. And zip and nib are very interchangeable. We were able to transition when we click on a cell using did select row at. So those are the two new things we saw today. We saw creating a zip file to create a custom cell, right? Because so far we've only seen custom cells in Storyboard, correct? We have our Storyboard, we drag elements to it, but that's tied to the Storyboard. I cannot use that cell someplace else, right? But here I have a zip file. I could use it in my favorites controller, which you will do. All what you have to do is register that nib. All you have to do in the view controller is register the nib, and you get that same cell. Okay? The cell for row add does all the logic already. It sets the cell up. And we also saw transitioning from one view controller to a next view controller using did select row add. So now we know, or we should be super comfortable with using prepare for segue, but did select is new. And did select we'll use a lot in programmable UI. Any other questions before we conclude? Yes, sir.
So you didn't have to, like, embed the navigation controller to go from one view controller to the other one?
No, because this particular view controller already is in a navigation controller. Why? Because in Storyboard, it's embedded already. In Storyboard, Storyboard knows the state of the view controller. So if we go to the Storyboard, this is the view controller, correct?
Right.
It's already embedded in the navigation controller. Xcode knows about that.
Oh, so I could,
That's why the navigation controller property, it gets set. The minute you do this, it gets set. So it's no longer nil.
so you just tell it where to go, so basically.
Exactly. I just tell it where to go. And you could tell it go wherever you want it to go.
Okay.
Okay? Like as you see, there's no connection there. Right? There's no connection there. Right? Cool. Yes?
I would assume with, along that line, you would be able to embed the navigation controller.
In code.
Programmatic.
Yes, you can. Or in code, it would be something like this. Don't pay attention here. But you would have like a VC here, you'd have like UI navigation controller here, you'd have like a root controller here, and then you'd have a VC here like this. So that view controller, that navigation controller, has a view controller inside of it. Okay? Coming up. Week and a half or next week, who knows? Any other questions? Cool. So again, what we did, we created the zip file here. Zip files are cool. I've seen them a lot in my jobs, right? Where you have old client jobs working on. You cannot say, oh, I'm going to get rid of that zip file and do everything in code. There's a budget there. There's money involved there, right? You'll fix it. You'll update the UI, right? And you'll move on. Cool? Any other questions? Great. So we have an opportunity to go to the favorites view controller. Right now it does not work. So we have an opportunity to go to the favorites view controller and register the podcast and set up the did select again here. Very similar to code to what we just did. Don't copy and paste, right? Look at it and know what you type in. If you have any questions, come back to us. Okay? Yes? All right, cool. So we'll end here.